This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the In Focus podcast. I'm your host, G. Sampath. Americans are all set to pick their 47th president on November 5th. The campaigns this time have been one of the most fractious of all time, and people may be used perhaps to the crude language of Republican nominee Donald Trump, but in the final stages of the presidential race, the Democratic side too seems to have followed suit, with Biden appearing to call Trump supporters quote unquote garbage and Kamala Harris referring to Trump as a petty tyrant. So, does this in an ironic way signal a victory, even if a petty victory for Trump, in being able to drag down the Democrats to his level, so to speak? And now we've seen reports that Arnold Schwarzenegger, former Republican governor of California, the state with the largest number of electoral college votes, has joined a few other prominent Republicans such as Liz Cheney and Jimmy McCain in backing Kamala Harris. Is that a big setback for Trump? Now, with the Trump campaign focused on immigration and Kamala Harris on women's rights, whose narrative has gained the upper hand? With barely a couple of days left for polling day, where do the two candidates stand with regard to key constituencies such as Latinos, blacks, especially black men, Arab and Muslim constituencies, and women? We discuss all these questions and more in this final preview before polling day, and we have with us Sanjay Ruparelia, Associate Professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration at Toronto Metropolitan University, where he also holds the Jarislowsky Democracy Chair. Sanjay, welcome to InFocus. Thank you so much for taking time out for this.
Thanks for having me, Sampath.
So, Sanjay, to start with, many feel that the 2024 presidential race has been pretty unique when compared to the previous ones, and perhaps also unique in the sense that it's quite critical in determining the future course not only for America and American democracy, but also for the world. In many parts of the world, Ukraine, Gaza come to mind. So, what are your key takeaways from the kind of campaigning, the issues, the themes, the diction, the language, everything taken together? What are your main takeaways as we approach polling day?
Yes, no, it's an extraordinary campaign. And, in the United States, as we know, politicians and commentators, political discourse generally, is often given to hyperbole. But it is hard to overstate the stakes of this because of Trump himself and what he did when he was in office last, and what, of course, he's promising to do now. I think what's striking is a number of things. One is, as you said, the campaign itself. I mean, it's extraordinary. Joe Biden was determined to run against Trump. It was only a really disastrous debate performance, which then led to, growing calls for him to step down and pressure, which he eventually did in time. So, if he, of course, had stayed on the ticket, I think we would be having a very different discussion right now. Kamala Harris, who was obviously underrated, might be one way of putting it, but certainly she had not performed well relative to others when she campaigned for the presidency, and during her vice presidency, had seemed to have made a series of missteps. And suddenly there was this euphoria in the Democratic Party, or parts of it, let's say, many parts of it, but not all. As you mentioned, Gaza has been a major issue, cleavage in the party. But suddenly she seemed to find her step and her groove. But in the last few weeks, there have been more commentary that, maybe she's lost some of that. There has been, as you say, a lot of vitriol, certainly from the Trump side and supporters towards Kamala Harris herself, towards the Democratic Party, towards many voters. And then, as you said in your opening remarks, there have been gaffes on the other side, yet once again by President Biden, who is known to make these gaffes. But, I think all of that is true. I think when you step back, what's so striking is, I suppose, two or three things. One is that Trump himself as a candidate is promising to take vengeance against his declared enemies, using the instruments and tools of the state to persecute them. In retaliation, he says, for his persecution. He's an indicted criminal now, facing many cases. So that's the first thing. He's openly saying this. So his former advisors have described him as a fascist. And that's led then to another debate. Is he a fascist? Is he an authoritarian populist? What is he? But he's clearly beyond the pale for most yardsticks for someone who's a Democrat or democratic as a leader. And then I think the other thing that's very striking is the asymmetry of expectations, right? That he is able to say whatever he wants, however contradictory it may be, whereas the Harris campaign has tried to, as I say, look presidential. I think she's put it really well, that the attempt there is to say he's not a serious man. He's a petty man, as you say, petty tyrant. But the implications of voting him back in again are deadly serious for the United States and for its ramifications on the world, simply because the U.S. is such a great power, even though it's diminishing. So from Gaza to Ukraine to world trade to public health, whatever it may be, the stakes are really high. And I suppose the third thing I would say, is a long answer to your first question, is how starkly polarized and divided the country seems to be. There are 50 states, over 160 million registered voters, and yet most analysts say it's going to come down to tens of thousands of voters in 7 swing states, and the ones who are undecided. So, do these last-minute statements or gaffes or events sway them towards one campaign or another and sway them to turn out? And so that's what's really striking. High-stakes election, deeply divided partisan differences, and yet it comes down to a handful of states and tens of thousands versus millions of voters in these states that will ultimately decide the election because of the nature of the electoral system, the electoral college.
Right. I mean, thank you for that, Sanjay. I mean, that's a nice sort of wrap of what we've sort of seen over the past several months. Now, you spoke about how this is a high stakes presidential race and the asymmetry of expectations between Trump and Harris. And I think there might also be, I mean, I don't know if it's okay to call it an asymmetry of expectations, but there is another dynamic at play here, which is that you spoke about the war in Gaza and how it seems to have divided the democratic camp. Now it's pretty sort of clear. Most people wouldn't dispute that if Trump were to be voted back. One is, of course, his vengeance dimension of it. The other is what he might do to American democracy. So it's clearly not in America's interests, domestic politics interests, for him to be back. But if you look at the international scenario, I mean, most people seem to, at least in the global south, favor Trump coming back rather than Kamala Harris and the Democrats, simply because they would see it, and this has been endorsed by, this sentiment has been endorsed by several Arab American / Muslim leaders in the US itself. It would seem like they are rewarding Biden for 1 year of genocide, quote unquote. So how do you, what are your thoughts on this asymmetry, so to speak?
That's a good question. I mean, what is happening in Gaza is horrific. And as you say, the Biden administration belatedly, let's say in the last 6 months, last 3 months, have been now trying to say, to pressure the Netanyahu government, to stop the bombing, to allow humanitarian aid in. It's a devastating situation in Gaza, now spreading to the West Bank slowly, and Lebanon, of course. And all of those words mean nothing because they continue to arm Israel. But I'm surprised when you say that governments in the South are favoring a Trump victory, in the sense, if you remember when Trump was president.
I didn't say governments, I said people. Those who have been, yeah, the people. Yeah. I mean, generally, intellectuals, the middle classes.
Yeah. Well, I think, what are they fastening onto? And again, Trump says so many things that are contradictory. It's
But
hard to
also,
know.
specifically Palestinians, seem to be favoring Trump. Palestinians in
Well,
particular.
I think they're so deeply angry and upset at the Democratic Party that they said you can't take our votes for granted. And it's particularly in the state of Michigan, which is one of these swing states. But of course, it's across the country. And Bill Clinton just recently gave a speech which was extraordinary. He basically said, to Muslim and Arab Americans that, we realize you're upset, but how could you not vote for us? And you should realize that Israel is fighting Hamas, which is a terrorist organization, and it's using Palestinians as human shields. So this is what the Democratic Party is dealing with it. What is Trump saying? He says, I will bring peace immediately to this conflict. I will end the conflict. He says similar things about Russia and Ukraine. And I suppose that's resonating with some voters who are Muslim or Arab American and some of those communities. But I think when we think about those, you have to think, of course, of two things. One is, When he himself was president last, of course, he imposed a temporary Muslim ban. He's now promising to expel lots of illegal migrants when he comes back to power, if he does. When he was last in power, he basically endorsed whatever Netanyahu wanted to do, including declaring Jerusalem, right, the undivided, indivisible capital of Israel, and was sort of seen as very pro-Israeli, of the pro-Israeli hard right. So I think it is striking that if there are some imams, for instance, who have, recently, it's hard to say how representative they are. It's hard to know. But if they've sort of said, well, Trump offers us more in this conflict, it's hard to sort of take that at face value. And of course, the question is, if you were to impose a peace, as he puts it, on what terms? It's hard to see, given who he is and what he stands for and the policies he enacted when he was first president and what he promises to do now, as any sort of imposition or a settlement being favorable to or even fair to Palestinians. So I think it's just a tortured situation that voters of the Democratic Party are absolutely right to be enraged with the party, given its policies and its stances and its basically impotence when it comes to this war and being able to influence it in any way that's desirable. At the same time, to put any faith in Trump, just seems like you're a hostage to fortune. And he's such an unpredictable man, yet his inclinations are always towards favoring those that are powerful in the status quo. So, yeah, I think that's it. It is striking, as you say. It's hard to put much faith that Trump would improve the situation.
Right. I mean, I think two desperate kind of situations or options. There used to be a time when one could simply, assume that certain groups or communities would go with a particular party. But this time around, we know that there are, Trump has got supporters, voters from all camps. Things are no longer very simple, black and white. We've seen Arab Muslim leaders endorsing Trump, the traditional, Democrat supporters who have backed him. So where do the two candidates stand actually in terms of the kind of support they are getting from key constituencies such as Latinos, blacks, black men, and women and so on? What is your sense? These various groups.
Yeah. So I think for all of those groups, they generally still favor the Democrats and Democratic Party. But as you say, it's striking that segments within each of these communities, Latino and Black men in particular, we've seen studies and reports from people who've conducted surveys and are doing psephology, that the percentage of men, particularly in the Latino and Black communities, that voted for Trump in 2016 was quite small, actually increased by 2020, even though he lost to Biden. And there are reports on the campaign trail now that they're supporting him. So the question is why? I think there have been two general explanations. One is that they credit him and his administration for better economic circumstances when he was last in power. This, of course, was before the pandemic and how that roiled the global economy and the inflationary spike we've seen since. But in terms of jobs, in terms of wages rising and so on, they sort of see favorable circumstances under Trump. So when they ask this question, were you better off 4 years ago or now, or 8 years ago or now? This is how they're responding. So again, we can discuss it, analyze it, and say it's maybe misplaced, of course, because to what extent was Trump responsible for those economic conditions or not? To what extent would he have handled the pandemic better? Of course, we saw that he handled it worse. He sort of said it wasn't even a real crisis, and many Americans died and suffered during that. But nonetheless, they credit him with that better economic performance. The second is what many analysts, particularly feminists, are saying is, it's a crisis of masculinity in many of our societies, as we know. And for some men in these communities, certainly white men, younger men, this is a particular demographic that Trump appeals to. This is a very sort of standard patriarchal conception, often quite misogynist as well, of masculinity. Sort of old-fashioned strength. He's projects himself as a strong man. He sort of says what he wants. He says things which are beyond the pale for many today. And he says he's against political correctness and equity, diversity, inclusion, and so on and so forth. And this sort of appeals to certainly a section of each of these communities, and particularly young men, who who are workers or what are called blue collar workers here, may have not gone to university. That sort of conception of masculinity appeals to them in the sort of roiling gender politics that, again, all of our societies are dealing with and undergoing. And I think those are sort of two dominant explanations. And again, it's really striking that the Trump campaign, will, as we know from a rally even just last week in Madison Square Garden, will openly insult Latino, Black, Jewish, Arab American voters. But yet, nonetheless, there are members, sections of these communities that are still willing to overlook that and favor him. So it's a real puzzle.
Yeah, so you mentioned like two really interesting reasons for this. One, of course, better economic circumstances under Trump, and the second is this crisis of masculinity. I was wondering if there is a third factor at play, which is Trump's anti-immigrant or anti-illegal immigrant rhetoric. Do black men relate to that kind of a logic where they feel that illegal immigrants are taking away their jobs or repressing or lowering their wages by sort of increasing the supply of labor for the kind of blue collar jobs they might be able to get? Is the illegal immigrant dimension also partly a factor in his getting support from Latino men, from black men, and so on?
That's an excellent question, and I think you've hit on something important. I mean, absolutely, the immigration issue has been a massive one in the United States. You sort of think of two major structural issues that are facing the U.S. is immigration, pressures of immigration, illegal migration across the border because of push factors in many countries, right? More desperate circumstances in Central South America, other countries, and as you say, there's certainly a stream across communities, and would include, I imagine, the African American community, a sort of a nativist streak saying, and not even some nativist streak, that's unfair. That, okay, we might be a nation of immigrants, but there's a proper way in doing this. People have stood in line, as they say, to gain access to the United States, to gain a green card, and so on. And people are coming across illegally. And if they're not refugees or asylum seekers, but they're simply just making their way across the border, which is a very perilous journey, many suffer, many don't make it.
We keep hearing reports in India about Gujaratis sort of dying while trying to cross the border from Canada.
Extraordinary, yes. So so you have those, as you say, very desperate situations in many countries pushing people to undertake this migration. But as you said, right, so there's a feeling in the US and a feeling now growing in Canada even, and certainly we've seen it in Europe, that yes, these are legal migrants, so therefore they're illegitimate, they're breaking the law, they should not be rewarded for this. I still think what's striking there is a division then between, I can see how that argument carries greater sway in the African American community or sections of it than the Latino community. Because if you think about it, as you've seen over successive administrations last decade or more, there are many who came illegally, as I say, decades ago from Central and South America, have been living in the United States, as what they call them, undocumented migrants. And Trump is promising or threatening to expel them. The Democrats have tried to finesse this issue by saying, well, there should be a path towards permanent residency or citizenship for those, particularly those that have never lived anywhere else, right? You sort of think of the children of these migrants. They've grown up in the United States. They have had no other home, even though their families may be from elsewhere. So it's striking there that, how would that argument play in those communities? I think it would be less the case. It might be the case certainly amongst, certain sections in white communities or black communities that maybe that would play more. It's hard to, I find it quite puzzling again in Latino communities, but there would be sections of them that say, there's a legitimate path to citizenship and not. And maybe that's a divisive issue in those communities as well. But you're absolutely right to put your finger on immigration. That's a huge issue, and it's one that has been very difficult for the Democrats to address properly. There are great pressures on the border, and they've struggled to deal with that in a way that's satisfactory.
Right, and I think there's one more factor as well, which is specific to the Democratic nominee Kamala Harris. I mean, I think there have been like plenty of documented reports saying that she, as a prosecutor in her state, I think California, is that she sent a lot of black men to prison. So that's not going to help the Democrats' cause among black men, would it?
Well, again, I mean, there are liberals and conservatives in all of our communities, and for some, they would see that as unfairly penalizing and targeting Black men, of course. And we know the criminal justice system in the United States is deeply flawed. And, the rates of charges against Black men in particular, overrepresented in the prison population in terms of prosecution and charges that are laid are differential for similar crimes committed by others. And yet there are members in the community who say, she has to sort of look tough, and they reward her for that as being a tough prosecutor against crime. And so again, I think in all these communities, just like in our own, there are going to be people of different political and ideological persuasions about how they think about this. How do they think about the justice system, the police, the courts? Do they consider the laws fair and fairly applied or not? I think that's, there's always a gender dimension to this as well. That Kamala Harris, being a woman, being a woman of Indian and Caribbean descent, has to sort of appear stronger than otherwise, right? So she has to, again, finesse this line of, on the one hand, showing that she's tough as a leader and willing to take tough, difficult decisions. This is the way language that's often used. At the same time that she represents a party that is going to be more progressive when it comes to social welfare and job creation, is more concerned about inequality and so on. So again, the Democrats have to find a way of sending multiple messages to different constituencies that might respond to these messages in different ways.
Right. No, I just want to ask you about something slightly removed from these kinds of questions, which is this whole Elon Musk factor. I've gone through and I reviewed, Musk's biography by Walter Isaacs, and so I sort of have a pretty solid understanding of his political views, how they've evolved. And he was at one point he was a supporter of Democrats. Says he's on record as having said that he met Trump. He wasn't particularly impressed, but now he's become a wholehearted Trump supporter. He's been giving away $1 million checks to randomly selected people who are sort of more or less, pledging their support for Trump by pledging for free speech and gun rights, so on. So how come he's able to do this in the U.S. electoral system? Like basically, you're buying votes, with money. So how is this not illegal, and how is this impacting Trump's campaign? Wouldn't it be viewed negatively, this kind of publicity?
Yes. Well, as we know, campaign finance laws in the United States are the most permissive, probably in the world, probably close to India's. And money plays an outsized role in U.S. politics. There is a case filed, it was filed in a state court, which has now been, I understand, kicked up to a federal court. And so it won't be decided in time for the election. This gimmick or this attempt to sway voters towards Trump that Musk is doing, as you say, paying everyone a check. I think it's $47 if they hand over their personal details. And then, as you say, enter a lottery to win. I think, Musk himself, I think like a lot of these billionaires, particularly in the tech world, many of them, you know more about this than I do, but many of them seem to embrace this a very libertarian ideology that somehow, they're self-made billionaires and they believe in this sort of radical libertarian free market ideology. Concomitant with that is the idea, again, of free speech, gun rights, a sort of idea that the state should be less intrusive in society and the market generally. And of course, Trump himself is promising, massive tax cuts. He already introduced tax cuts in his last administration, which disproportionately benefited the wealthy. And he's promising to make those permanent if he comes back. And so it's not surprising that billionaires, of course, support both parties, Democratic and Republican, but typically Republican administrations keep promising tax cuts, less regulation. That favors those who have enormous wealth and wish to increase it. I think that's generally how billionaires operate. They sort of support the party that are going to increase their fortunes. We've seen this with figures like Steve Schwartzman, for instance, and others supporting Trump despite what he stands for, despite what he says. They overlook that because their own fortunes are going to grow. And I think there's another way. We see this in Musk's takeover purchase of Twitter, now X, that now they have other ambitions too, that they can exercise enormous power and wield political influence without holding office of any kind, but simply because they control these massive media platforms and have massive amounts of money that, of course, they contribute to the candidates that can sway their policies. So yeah, I mean, Musk has become, is a very dark figure in all of this, and his influence on Trump certainly is growing. It appeals to very similar sentiments that that Trump himself has. I don't think it's going to, that this latest intervention is going to. It won't stop before the election, which is simply next week. But it's a foretaste of what's to come. That if Trump were to come back, the power of figures like this are going to grow. We've another incident, as we know, is the Washington Post very recently, for the first time in decades, did not refuse to endorse a single candidate. It's owned by Jeff Bezos. The argument was they didn't want to take a stance. He says it's not right. But of course, newspapers do this all the time. They do take a stance on an editorial line of who they favor. And that was seen again as either Bezos's favor of Trump, but without wanting to say it, because the Washington Post is, a heralded liberal paper, of course.
All the candidates the Washington Post had endorsed in the past were Democrats.
Mm. Yes, I don't know for a fact, but I imagine there would be. I mean, this is again a very famous liberal paper from the days of Watergate before. So I think so. One is, simply he privately favors Trump, doesn't want to sort of say it openly. The second, of course, is that he fears some kind of retribution if the paper were to support the Democrats. And again, that gets back to Trump's promises that if he comes back to power, he's going to use the executive power of the state to seek vengeance against his perceived enemies. And he said that openly. He's called these people enemies that need to be locked up. You remember the last campaign, right, against Hillary Clinton? That was the chant, lock her up. And so this is the politics that he represents.
Right. In this context, we have another famous Republican former governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, who has now, endorsed Kamala Harris, and is from a state with the largest number of electoral college votes, and he joins other prominent Republicans like Liz Cheney and Jimmy McCain in backing Harris. Are there a lot of such Republicans? When there is this whole, hypothesis that many of them would sort of hold their noses and back Trump. But is that sort of not going to work to a great extent? Is this a setback? To what extent is it going to impact Trump? These big quote unquote influencers sort of switching to the other camp.
Yeah, that's another really important question. It is striking that figures like Schwarzenegger, Liz Cheney, the U.S. Journalists Bill Kristol and others have come out very strongly against Trump. They're sort of seen as old establishment Republicans. Trump was this maverick who broke the China and entering the home and took over the party, turning it in his own image. So of course for these Republicans, he represents a great internal danger, and he has, of course, not just represents, he's become that. He's taken over their party. And I suppose for other Republican voters who are concerned about that, these figures and the fact that they're endorsing Harris will carry a lot of sway. But I think the fact that they do represent, they're very different figures, but because they do also represent an establishment, of course, that is very much part of Trump's populist appeal and argument. That, he, of course, is part of an elite, a failed businessman, but somehow still a billionaire. But that's his point, right? That this is an old elite that did nothing for you, particularly those who are workers in 40, 50 years of neoliberal economic policy. And I am the person who's not from Washington. I don't represent these old interests. I represent you, and I'm going to smash this old establishment. So for those who support Trump for those reasons, a Liz Cheney or a Bill Kristol or a Schwarzenegger or anyone else is just going to be seen as the elite that they want to displace by electing Trump. And I think so. Again, it depends on what kind of Republican are you. Are you an old Republican voter who is scandalized and alarmed by Trump? Or are you one who has been disaffected for a long time and maybe even recently has joined the Republican Party but hadn't voted before because you are swayed by his populist appeals and his strongman tactics against an old elite?
Right. This sort of parallels the two kinds of Democrats. When you spoke about the old Republican and the post-Trump Republican who has to sort of reinvent himself to match this new image, and then there is the old Democrat who would stand up for progressive liberal ideals, and the new Democrat who will who will have to stand by progressive and liberal ideals in the face of genocide. So there is this dichotomy in both camps. Now, coming to the numbers side of things. Uh, anyway, before that, if you look at the big picture narratives, there have been two competing narratives. One which Trump has sought to push forward is to do with immigration. That's his main plank. And for Kamala Harris, it's been women's rights, abortion, and then, of course, saving American democracy and so on. Do you get a sense of which one of these two big thematics has sort of gained the upper hand, or is it the top of the mind space of voters in general, without sort of putting them into different camps? Is there like a bigger, is one of them more dominant in people's minds or in the discourse than the other?
I don't know how to answer that question. I mean, for the electorate as a whole, of course. I think the economy clearly is top of mind for many voters. You might say for a majority of voters. Here, I think one of the great puzzles has been that the Biden administration, and ironically, given Biden's past record, it's even more the case. The Biden administration has been the most progressive for labor that we've seen in generations, certainly probably since Lyndon Johnson. Some are arguing even since FDR introduced the New Deal, right? During the pandemic, the latter part, when Biden came in, after Trump had created mayhem in many ways, almost close to $2 trillion were spent to protect families and workers who had lost income. And then we've seen more recently a whole series of legislation, which will take some years to really unfold, I think. But basically, and to expand infrastructure in the United States, to create new green jobs, to reshore, right, industrial activity and production, which had been sent overseas through globalization over the last few decades. So what's really striking is that inflation has come down, wages are increasing, growth is back. Amongst the G7, the United States is growing faster than any other country. And yet, people still feel that they're worse off than they were 4 years ago because they've gone through this extraordinary turmoil in the American economy and the global economy. So Biden is not getting the credit. And I think that's been a key issue, right? And it's been a great puzzle because objectively, things are better than they were 4 years ago. If you ask the counterfactual, if Biden had not done a lot of these things, of course, a lot of the stimulus spending for economists also fueled inflation. But again, it's trying to restructure the economy. And it's doing something really striking, which is that it is departing from a neoliberal framework, a policy framework that says the state should simply retreat and let the market dynamics decide questions of production and consumption and distribution. The state is suddenly taking a more steering role. As we know, in India and other countries in the South, what we would often call, that prize was obviously the idea of a developmental state, right, in the post-war era. So I'm not saying it's not a developmental state in the United States, but the state is suddenly becoming prominent again in regulating and steering the economy and economic activity in questions of investment and trade and production under Biden. It'll take time for some of those policies to bear fruit. There's a lot of complications about investments and regulations at the state level, how many deals that have been signed actually lead to factories being built and jobs created and so on. But it's striking there. And I think that's a slow-burning process. And if the election, for instance, were a year or two from now, we might see some of the fruits of those policies, but they're still taking time. And so because people are really struggling with this cost of living crisis in the United States, many families living paycheck to paycheck, Trump's message seems to strike a chord with them. It resonates that you were better off when I was president, you'll be better off again. But as we know, most economists say that his policies will make most working class families much worse off. Imposing tariffs on China in particular, but countries generally, will simply raise the cost of goods that are important to the United States. And so you're in this extraordinary situation, where things objectively will be worse under Trump, but somehow his message is resonating with voters, and despite the fact that very few of any economists would support them.
Right. It is indeed very strange, that as you said, objectively speaking, under Biden, the economy has sort of worked better for the working classes or is on that track, but they are not able to sort of sense it, subjectively speaking, and they are more drawn to the kind of seductive rhetoric of Trump, bring the jobs back from China and, go after China kind of a thing. Now, well, one last question, Sanjay, before I let you go. No, the latest polls give Kamala Harris a 1 percentage point lead, 44% for Harris, 43% for Trump. So, how do we interpret this? Does this mean that the seven swing states are going to decide? And if so, like, what are things looking like in those seven states? Is any one of them the key where you think it's really going to determine the outcome? What are your thoughts as we sort of wrap this up?
Yeah. I mean, national polls and sort of are, of course, important to understand, the sentiment across the country. But what will eventually happen and what matters crucially is, as you say, what happens in these seven swing states. The path to victory, as they say, if you put all the states that are reliably Democratic and reliably Republican aside, and that's 43, it comes down to these seven. And there are different permutations. I've read that there could be 20 different paths to victory for either party. And so it's not clear that any one state is the deal breaker. But the most electoral college votes, for instance, are from Pennsylvania. Most commentators say it would be very hard for either candidate to win the presidency if they lose Pennsylvania. Not impossible, but the odds go against them. And I think, and when we look at the polling in each of these states, in some of them Trump is up, in some of them Harris is up. But what's striking is that the margins are so tiny that they're all within the margin of error. So, for instance, Pennsylvania, Trump is up by 1%. Georgia, he's up by 2. North Carolina, he's up by 1. In Michigan, Harris is leading, but less than 1%. In Wisconsin, she is up by 1% or more. So this is all within the margin of error. And as we know, the polls can get it wrong. These are really questions of finitude. I think everything's going to come down to this weekend, and we're seeing it. It's really going to be turnout. Which party can get their voters out? And there's been a lot of early voting, but this weekend there's going to be a massive push, and you can feel it literally in the air. There's there's an intensity to this campaign, and it's building to a crescendo. I think turnout will be key. And then we're just going to have to wait and see. And the crucial thing, of course, as we know, is Trump has already tried to lay the ground as he tried to overturn the last election, the counting of the votes on January 6th. He's already sort of preparing the ground to say if he loses the election, it's because it was rigged or flawed or in some way.
Haven't there been a lot of litigation around this question?
Well, there's a lot of worry and preparation about this, right? That, will the integrity of the election hold? Will the counting of votes take place without interference or pressure or coercion, particularly by the Trump campaign? And so, yes, there are lawyers and there are administrators and political staff. I mean, every side is gearing up to make sure that the vote has its integrity is secured. And I'm sure it's the case that there will be cases in probably a number of states where there are lawsuits filed and for recounts and so forth. So we might not know how this really plays out for some time unless there is somehow some kind of a sweep or a landslide for either candidate, which is very hard to see given, as you say, the polls are so evenly poised. But we sort of brace ourselves for the outcome. I think in this case, comparing it to India is very striking, isn't it? I mean, exit polls in India saw the BJP and the NDA coming back very strongly. And then there was a massive surprise. And a government was formed, a new coalition government was formed very quickly. I don't think we're going to see that process happen in the United States. I mean, barring a sweep somehow. It's going to be very protracted and contested, simply because Trump has indicated that's what he wants to do if he doesn't clearly win. So there'll be a lot to talk about and observe and in the days and weeks ahead.
Right. I mean, it's an election of very fine margins, and as you said, I mean, the Trump campaign have already laid the ground for all kinds of questionings and possible disputes. So much at stake, and I think it's going to be a really a big week. Lots to talk about next week. Thank you so much, Sanjay, for your thoughts and observations. Interesting and insightful as always. Absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sampath. It's great talking to you as well.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.